Typhon. Typhon thought of Gigi and raged inside as he did so and kicked his stallion. He would ride this horse until either he calmed down or the stallion fell from exhaustion. With wild agility and clear abandon, Typhon rode his stallion at full pace, geeing the horse onto maximum pace, and his horse neighed in derision coupled with remorse, for the horse knew what was to come, and on cue, Typhon whipped the horse's flank, and the stallion responded, knowing better than to aggravate his master further. Typhon bellowed as he rode, a deep guttural bellow that shook the trees and animals around him. More than a few miles radius, the birds rustled the leaves and the branches as they flew off in fear, and the ground fellows scurried from their duties and into the safety where they could find it. All creatures, great and small, knew of these screeches and bellows and despised the source of where they came from. All and sundry were thankful their woeful visitor was here, but for a few moments, and all their eyes watched him passing dubiously from the safety of burrow and bush. She is likely here for the battle and for him. He did not doubt it. Even in old age, that fearless and glorious creature, who knew no fear of him, wanted recompense just as he did. His thoughts and memories raced through his mind and body as he rode. That first time they had faced each other in the First Great War, she knew no fear of him even back then. In fact, he could sense her hate of him. It was like a perfume from her, this hatred, and he breathed in every scent of it, and even to this day, he relished and basked it in. The first time that he encountered her, she had not taken her gaze off of him when they came face to face in the wooded land, and she had eyed him with not an ounce of stress or fear. He had seen her watching him and had watched her back. She was calling on the earth to create an arrow and bow of her own, and cause the tip to be drenched in the poison ivy of the most serious kind. She did this without taking her eyes off of him once, and without hiding any secret of what she was doing, or her intentions of doing it. He had stayed on his horseback a distance away from her, and watched as she picked up the freshly made arrow off of the ground, and had dipped its tip into a little puddle on the ground. That little puddle on the ground was steaming, not from heat, but from a poison nettle. And the earth woman had dipped the tip of the arrow into it slowly, eyes still firmly upon him, and no expression upon her face would be made. Even though it was the first time he had ever laid eyes on her, he knew exactly who she was, not only by her stately appearance, but by her steady countenance. He still did not know if she knew him before that day and knew that Gigi would never tell. She did like to keep certain secrets. This he discovered over the decades, and he hated that. He hated that she held things to herself that he did not know. It ate at him internally more than he liked to admit to himself. With certain intent, they eyed each other. Typhon was not moving on his horse, and the wonder, as he had come to call Gigi, was holding him to ransom with her gaze, for he could not read her. He watched as she slowly turned her arrow about in the poisoned pond a little longer than necessary. If that arrow stayed too long in the pond of poison, it surely would have disintegrated, and if he had true and honest thoughts about this, I sincerely hoped that this would be the case. She was an expert marksman for someone so new to the task, even when her target was on the move. The markswoman picked up her bow from the ground, and with her free arm, and positioned herself to execute her desire with slow, calm, and even movements. She raised her single arrow and placed it in the bow, and without hesitation or warning, the arrow was expelled from the bow and propelled toward the target. It came too quickly at him for him to respond hurriedly. He was hit in the rib cage. He felt the tip penetrate with not much more force than a pinprick between his ribs. Typhon had merely been out riding for pleasure. He was innocent in his position that day, as no task of work or war had been assigned to him, and he had not consulted his guide for any impending wariness or danger. Therefore, no body armour nor any protective clothing that day had been worn, or no protective chant had been cast, something that he would never be guilty of again, as long as he lived. Breaking sight for the first, Typhon glanced at the arrow, then at Gigi in disbelief, and then dug his heels into his horse and fled. He knew that even though he had regularly consumed protective concoctions, they would only act as a buffer or guard against the poison's effects and reduce the poison's effects for a time. He had fled and fled quickly back to his place of safety. If the arrow were to stay in his flesh for any unreasonable length of time, it would cause the poisoning of blood, and then the stiffening of the limb, and then the eye and ear would bleed. This would be the occurrence before the breaking down of all internal organs, and resulting in a slow, lingering, and highly unpleasant demise. He had recovered well, albeit slowly, and his doctors had told him that he would carry a little of that poison in his body permanently. I explained it to Typhon that this was the most unusual side effect that had ever been noted in a survivor of such a poison. It would never be made known to the doctors that the poison of the pond had melded itself together with an experimental concoction. The concoction comprised substances of unknown origin by an alchemist of dubious credibility for making both skin and organs able to withstand all forms of physical penetration. This was being produced with the hope of physical invincibility, being a natural state of one is being. So, for Typhon, once he learned that such an experiment was occurring, knew that this was too much for him to resist not being part of it. His penchant for desiring what should not be sought was a part of Prince's nature. He could not resist such things. Little did he know that the very thing he sought, which was invincibility and resistance to all things that he considered vulnerable or weak, would be the very thing that would give him his greatest weakness. This was emotional subordination to another person, a much worse fate to him than physical subordination or weakness would ever be. The experiment of the past year, coupled with ingesting the concoction as recently as the previous day, had left Tyson in a particular state of vulnerability for which nobody was equipped. The experiment was taking hold of Tyson's body, and his skin and organs were definitely becoming resistant to all forms of penetration. What was an untested and unknown side effect had also been imparted. Not only had the concoction been a success in reducing the penetration of the arrow in Tyson's torso, but it had also worked as a binding agent inside of the vessels of Tyson. The experimental concoction had bound itself to the poison of the pond, and with it, a caveat of emotion that was delivered by the messenger of the poison arrow and his own. Despite himself and out of immediate admiration of Gigi's immediate and brazen shot, admiration had risen in Typhon the moment. He knew her by reputation, and by this reputation he had long considered her a worthy opponent regardless of their lack of acquaintance, and now he had witnessed her guile first-hand and for himself. The grounded, earthy passion and the poise which she possessed as she conducted herself in their first encounter was all he had ever imagined about her. He had been enthralled in those first moments due to her stealthiness and for her intensity, and especially for her fearlessness, for he was not used to bearing witness to such things. The emotion with which Gigi used to call the poison pond, and the bow and arrow into existence, and the focused intensity with which she had dipped that spoken of the arrow, and the dominance she felt when she let the arrow go, and the triumphant passion which she felt had entered into Typhon's very soul the moment he was hit. Add to this his own deep responses to her, as well as the dire state of the situation in which he found himself. This left him with what would become a permanent sense of unease regarding the peculiarity of his newfound emotive state. The woe of being bound up in an unexpected moment of emotional intensity upon his receiving an arrow to his rib would be the fate that would forever define Typhon. Typhon at the moment of being hit with the poison. The poison in the arrow caused in him to be in a permanent state of deep armour, admiration of Gigi. This also birthed with him a deep loathing with this keeper of the earth. He loathed because she had incited in his responses that he spent his life trying to dispel himself, or even never knowing what could be felt before. He held a loathing of her because she caught him unawares in the forest, and almost in one instant brought about his demise. It was not just this encounter that he loathed her for. He loathed her because he recognized in her what he despised in himself, and he loathed her because he loved her for being those same very things that he despised for himself. He loathed her because he loved her. Both victim and victee had encountered each other in that serendipitous moment, with emotions running deep in both of them and an invisible three-chord strand that had entwined them together by way of an experimental concoction, a poison arrow, and with it their own internal longings of their souls, particularly his. He would come to learn her response to him was somewhat more rudimentary and less vile in nature than Typhon's personal response to her. Her parcel of responses to him and their situation were wrapped in bafflement and bewilderment, and seemingly nothing more. To this he could not understand, and musings of this only kept him up some nights and not all. If he could know thankfulness and appreciation for this, he would. Though he did not know these certain things. Over the months, years, and decades, their encounters would get a little more hostile, and a little more intense, and a little more violent. He could tell that Gigi was a little perturbed by him, but she always matched him in a war blow by blow. She seemed to always take his behaviour in her stride, and he knew that she understood him to be her chief nemesis and had, in her calm way, accepted it. He knew that she was here because she knew that there was a major storm coming, and he also knew that she did not know what was laid out before all of Alasia, and he relished the thought of that first initial moment that Gigi would know and understand. A fire flickered in his eyes for just one moment, and a sensation ran through his body. He snarled for a microscopic second, and the corners of his mouth gave way to a microscopic fleeting smile. She must know of the smokestack, and what it meant, so he gathered in his own mind that Gigi must have known the war was brewing. "A little sore and sorry." Guthrie did not walk. He laid, unsure of where to go or what to do next. The lad just lay where he was contemplating the blue sky. He could see that very, very far into the distance in the east was a very dark and stormy sky, and wondered about it. He focused on the dark sky to try to ignore the pain that was now seizing up his body. Where'd the storm manifest from? He guessed it was not from the west. He hazarded a guess that this storm may come in from the north, and was heading south because there were no signs that a storm had been where he was for quite some time. His surroundings were sun-drenched. Testament to this was that soreness, stiffness, and dizziness had now consecrated themselves within his body, and he resigned himself to the fact that lying here on fairly arid beach sand in this unknown place, and this would be his portion for the time being. Instinct arose in him that suggested that as unpredictable as Wendy was, and that, unless she had dropped him as her charge, she would eventually come for him. With surety in his own reasoning, he allowed the pain to take over his body and the throb to pound at his head, offering no resistance to any of it, which would only make him feel worse. "This was one hell of a beating you took," he told himself. He gave a little chuckle, which immediately turned to a cough of pain that rose from his chest and seared through his nervous system. He closed his eyes for a second. Even moving his eyeballs hurt and caused pain, which resulted in increased throbbing in his jaw and head. Guthrie lay and contemplated the storm in the distance, which was in contrast to the blue sky overhead, deciding to focus his attention on the storm in the distance. He had seen a few storms in his time, but marvelled at how dark and thick the cloud cover was, even that far in the distance, and so he remained staring at the storm, contemplating it. Guthrie had only seen clouds that were black and low to the ground a few times in his life, and remembered those times as something quite extraordinary. He had remembered that those storm clouds had made the middle of the day almost like the blackest and most moonlitless of any night, and full silence reigned with it over his city on those days. This storm, which was far in the distance, but so vivid with its random lightning bolts and black clouds, made him wonder if the place over yonder, the source of those storms, was back home. He wondered if these two worlds had collided before, and it made him wonder if whatever was coming was also coming for his world too. Wendy had told him what and who he was, the keeper of the wind. He was charged with controlling and using the element for good. Wendy had told him that he had learnt to control the wind well, but he still had to learn how to use the wind, and what the wind could do under his control. His lessons here were only just beginning, and she had walloped him a new one on the side of the cliff the last time they trained. He knew by Wendy's temperament that he was burdened with a cumbersome task, as he knew through his teacher that the wind will blow where the wind will blow. This was why mastering the art of control was the crucial part of his learning, and probably exactly why. He had copped such a bruising from whatever that unworldly creature-like man was. His lack of understanding and mastering of the talents and gifts of the wind was most likely why he copped such mockery. It ate at him, though. It ate at Guthrie deeply and quietly. He vowed, at the time of his physical and verbal berating, that he was going to be the greatest keeper of any element that was ever called upon, and whoever that man was that flattened him out, he would suffer at Guthrie's hand if it were the last thing that he ever did. He certainly was not getting his hands on Brooke or anyone else on his team. It did leave Guthrie wondering about his enemy and his fascination with Brooke. Brooke was a brand new keeper. What on earth could he want with her so early into her journey? Surely, with her in the infancy of her calling, he would know how to locate her very easily, and what on earth was it about Brooke that caused such a vehemently urgent response in the dude? A wind that appeared in the stillness stopped the boy in thought. Wendy had made her way to him and took her usual loosely shaped human form as she stood over him and contemplated his injuries. "My goodness, child, what on earth happened to you?" Guthrie just tried to smile but could not. Wendy, still in her same form, hovered over the top of him, and she blew over him with her breath. She started at the tip of his head. Wendy felt to him like a cool and very soft fan as she blew her soft breeze over his face and body. She blew into his eyes, which he tried to protest too, but in jest. He did not have the strength to proffer any verbal or physical defense against it. He was glad that he did not, because, as she blew over his eyes, and his nervous system braced itself. Though, too much relief, his eyes did not feel the pain as he expected. The jolt of his nerves gave way to sweet relief. His eye sockets did not feel like heavy weights of searing pain anymore. There was no sensation, except a small tingle, and the feeling of his eyes returning to normalcy. Wendy blew on his left cheek and then his right one. This lightness of breath was the coolest and softest sensation to be experienced. The tempering of searing pain and laborious breathing that a broken jaw had gifted felt this sweet relief. In fact, his jaw felt stronger than ever before, and so did his teeth. There seemed to have never been any experience of relief to have ever been encountered before, ever in the history of the universe according to the mind and body and the very soul of its receiver. This bodily restoration was happening all over his body as Wendy went to work healing and rejuvenating his body. Guthrie waited on the ground for a few moments for his tingling sensations to pass. He moved his fingers and then his legs, trying to comprehend what had just occurred within him. Guthrie contemplated what had put him in this position. He had copped an absolute beating and had absolutely no physical defenses at his disposal, nor did he have any idea on how to call on or use the wind to use for his own advantage. Guthrie was vile with anger and hatred for that creature, and this rose in him with an active volcanic rage which was only subdued by the sense of self-loathing for being so ill-prepared and weak in his defences. He had thought himself a mental weakling and grossly unprepared for what he had encountered. Guthrie bounced to his feet to test out his body. He was not wrong in assuming that he was stronger and healthier than he was before he was hurt. With swift martial arts movements, he quickly realized his strength and quickness had greatly increased. He had let known the whereabouts of Brooke, and who knows what else he had revealed to his newly appointed nemesis. Though, if Wendy could strengthen his body, why couldn't she strengthen his mind and his resolve, too? She could make him an absolute force to be reckoned with, unstoppable even. "That was something remarkable that you did with my body, Wendy. I have never felt better. We need you in dominant form, Guthrie. I could have done with this extra strength and form a few hours ago, before I got my butt kicked by whoever that was." "Is that what happened to you, son? Who beat you so thoroughly?" Guthrie tousled the back of his head. "I dunno, he started at me with a bow and arrow. I didn't even see him coming. He came almost out of thin air. Like a friggin' ninja, he was." Guthrie shook his head before going on. "And then he just started at me about where Brooke was." "Brooke?" queried Wendy. "Yeah, he just kept saying, 'Where is she? I know she's here.' Just stuff like that. He was almost crazy with it. I told him she was through the portal and back on the beach. And then he started wailing on me about how useless I was, and then gave me the hiding of me life. Never had a beating like it before, not even from me, old man." Guthrie's voice trailed off, and he spoke with quietness and shame. "I folded pretty damn quick, too, and let him know where she was." He averted his eyes and studied the ground. "I hate myself for it, too." He used the opportunity to change the subject. "I am feeling a damn sight stronger now, though. Just gotta toughen up me mind now. You reckon you could help me out with that, Wendy? Since you done such a great job with me body, I reckon I will be close to invisible if you fixed me up that way." He was almost shy in his asking. "You only get repaired in your body to greater than your previous state if your beaten body will you at a disadvantage, and yours would have been rendered useless, so I took liberties that I possibly shouldn't have in upgrading you." "What do you mean upgrading me? You haven't turned me into some kind of freak, have ya?" Wendy was still uncharacteristically patient with him and whispered, "No, Guthrie, I haven't. You are still completely human, just a stronger and more coordinated you." "Well, if me mind was stronger, I could outwit that slithery creep. I will too, if it is the last thing that I ever do." "See, my lad, talking like that will convince no one to increase your mental gains if you're out solely for your own benefit. It's not why you are becoming who you are, why you have been gifted, Guthrie." He averted his eyes again and resumed looking at the ground. "I nearly let him have her. I was freaking scared. I nearly shh." "Guthrie, you didn't let him have her, though. All you did was give away her whereabouts. You never led him to her." Guthrie didn't want to hear it. "Anyway, who was he?" "I suspect that it was one brother. I suspect that it was Typhon. Are you sure it was Brooke that he sought?" Inner childhood insolence briefly took his resolve. "Thinking of it, he didn't say her name. I just guessed." After a pause, Guthrie queried, "One of the brothers, Typhon. That's a pretty stupid name, that is. What a wannabe he is." "He is the middle of 3 brothers. Their father Alastor rules the Alcadons, which are all the wastelands and the barren lands and the skies and the underground around that land. It is a great province outside of Alasia, and to the west, the Valley of Huxley lies there, and it is where Alastor and his 3 sons run their headquarters." "I'm guessing they're the enemy then. That's who we're fighter." "It is Guthrie, yes. What do I have to do to beat him? What do I have to learn?" "First you have to know what drives each of them, what motivates them, and what their strengths are, and then learn what their weaknesses are. And then you can defeat them. First things are first, Guthrie. You have to learn your own talents and powers." "Well, let's go then. No time to waste. No time like the present then. I want to take him down." It seemed that an improved body is not all that you received. Your zeal has increased and your temperance even less in check. We shall use that to great advantage. Let's get started then, Guthrie. But first eat. There is fruit on those trees 100 yards over. Get your fill, son." Guthrie ate an unusual fruit with a peachy hue. The fruit was sweet and bitter, and filled him in only a few bites. He marvelled at this, but said nothing. His body, upon eating this unusual delight, enjoyed a surge of even more increased energy and physical strength, not only to his body, but to his mind as well. He felt sharper and clearer-minded with it too, and even more alert. He wanted to know what tricks and knowledge he could regarding the wind and what it could offer. Guthrie felt ready and focused like never before. Wendy knew this and was ready to teach. In the Valley of Huxley, Angst is afoot. Past the boundaries of Alasia and through the blackness, vastness lay some black stumps. Further beyond these black stumps were steaming hot pools of gases with rotting noxious fumes which carried rock and stone pathways that floated on the surface and were the pathways into the desert plains of the Valley of Huxley. If one could make it through the many, many hundreds of miles to its center, a person would find themselves in a luminous and decadent valley. It was not so much filled with the glorious wonders of nature, but filled with opulent structures constructed with the finest of gems and metals and precious stones, and such things as emeralds, opals, and rubies. Entire structures had been laboriously put together with painstaking precision. This dwelling offered an illusion to any eye that beheld it, a design that pleased the eyes of the beholder, for its construction had been done so with magical metallurgy and meticulous precision. The shape of the magnificent construction was adjusted according to what the viewer wanted to see, and not its true form, which was, to Alastor and his heirs, the most unusual and refined form of any noble structure in all of the seen and known universes. The true form of this construction was to never be known by anybody else, but those with proper lineage and who are true heirs to the building. This was Alastor, the recently retired ruler of all of the Alcadines, and his 3 male heirs. The great headquarter itself had been constructed with very fine diamond and ruby dust, and nothing more, and this building had taken more than an Elasian century to complete to its entirety. Creatures were designed and developed for being used as labor for its construction, and no regard had ever been given to the thousands of creatures who had been worked to their very deaths for its construction. Rumor had even had it that these creatures of labor had once been the children that had mysteriously vanished from that plane that was known as the flat earth. It was rumored also that these children had been kept and experimented on and mutated to such a point as to be unrecognizable as humans anymore. These rumors were further perpetuated by the belief that those experimental pursuits had been undertaken right underneath the mentioned structure. These rumors had been swirling around for quite the millennia, and it could not be verified by whom or by where these rumors started. This did not matter, and the story was passed down through the ages to scare offspring. While scaring the children of the healthy Elasian provinces was something that had never been promoted or ever entertained, it certainly was by the inhabitants of the Olkegdons and its surrounds, and was occurring on this very day. Alastor was currently listening to such tales being regaled, and smiled at the gasps of horror by all the little uns that listened. He was sitting hidden from any seeing eye on a bench that was carved inside of one wall of his palatial dwellings, so there was no awareness of his presence, for he loved to listen to these stories, and never tired of the shrieks of those that adorned their ears to such tales of horror and woe, of those children of the earth, forever lost to the underground chambers dedicated to the cause of human refurbishment. Hindra, the eldest of 3 brothers and current ruler of the Alcadines, was in a state of euphoria, whether anger or pleasure, immediate observation could not know it. He stormed through the halls of the impressive structure. His presence caused the most luminous of the precious stones in the walls to dim to an almost blackened state as he passed, with the stones taking the best part of the rest of the day to recover their illuminating form. Such was the emotion with which passed them. Any creature that thought Hindra might see them as he passed by recoiled and hid for fear of any recourse. They hid by tree trunk and burrow, and by any hole or crevice in the ground or wall. From quivering bodies, tiny eyes watched from safe confines as Hindra came by, hurrying with both intensity and focus. Creatures were grateful for his quick passing, for it was not unusual for Hindra to strike down any creature in any manner of cruel fashion in any of his given moods, good or bad. It was a delightful pastime of Hindra's doing so, and all creatures great and small knew this. With confidence, it could be said that all and sundry would not be sad should Hindra find his demise, and the sooner the better, in all of their minds. Easily noted that Hindra was emotional, though the source of this emotion was not easily noted and was yet to be revealed to Alastor. Alastor stood from his chair and moved out of his position inside the wall, making himself visible to all as he presented himself to all under a vestibule. Nobody seemed alarmed or perturbed by his sudden appearance from the wall, though were even further silenced by the approaching presence of Hindra. They could feel his presence from quite a distance away. By all that observed, there had been an unspoken suspicion amongst them that Alastor already knew what caused such emotion in Hindra, but all stood by, waiting with quiet intent. Naeme's call of duty. After Naeme's and the Flame's very private conversation earlier that morning, of which Bridie was not privy, Naeme had told his young charge that he had gathered some of the local children to regale her with stories of Alastor from times and eras gone by. In doing so, it was his private hope that she would learn all about Alastor and its history, and the result would be allowing her to gain through this sneaky device a memorable love and a deep beating heart for the land. It was also his further hope of her becoming enthralled with and developing a soul-binding connection to the place she would soon be fighting for. His was his hope that she would fight, not out of a sense of duty and responsibility to which she had been called, but out of a sense of duty and love of land and a sense of citizenry. Naeme had seen this tactical work of persuasion by sentimentality work on keepers of the elements time and time again. In fact, in his own youth, a young Naeme had been one of these little children calling out over all the others, excited to tell the tales of woe and hardship, romance and victory of both villain and hero of Alastor to the new upcoming heroes. Naeme's current act of truancy against Alastor policy and personal responsibility allowed him the permission of using a little further spiritual manipulation on the child to encourage this course to come to its full fruition. He softly laid his hand on her little Bridie's head for only a moment or two, while uttering with barely more than a movement of lip and tongue a small prayer. The girl did not notice and suspected the laying on of hands was Naeme, prompting her to move over to the small gathering of children. As he led Bridie over to this group of gathering children, Naeme had caught Mrs. Brownstone's eye, who had been watching as she knitted a scarf in her rocking chair under a coolabah tree. Her lips were a little pursed. Even the great Naeme himself did not like being on the receiving end of such a tight lip-pressing from the likes of Mrs. Brownstone. He avoided her eyes, which had narrowed so very slightly, and he felt them on him like two burning hot rays. Naeme picked up his speed just a little bit, in the vain hope that he could avert her a little more quickly, for he knew that she very clearly did not approve of his tactics regarding young Bridie. Right here in this moment, he knew that she knew, and his heart felt like it shrunk a little and blackened a little in his chest. Alastor's sage and seer felt anything but that currently. He had long been considered the purveyor of wisdom and a revered ruler in roles in which he felt like a charlatan more often than not. These were positions that had been thrust upon him, and never at one time he felt he had earned them by merit, contrary to what the elders of Alastor had assured him of. Whilst he knew unequivocally that the elders were inherently compulsive truth-tellers and therefore could not lie by natural default. The Great Spirit would revoke them of their positions with immediate urgency, should such a heinous thing as lying occur, which Naeme knew would not or couldn't occur. This knowledge that they were wholly truth-tellers is what contributed quite grievously to his own personal worries. These thoughts bothered Naeme to a level which felt to him to be almost without measure. Naeme's mind and heart were sorrowful for his unbelief and mistrust of himself. He knew that his own internal compunction had some influence on his distrust of others. Naeme asked himself whether such a distrust of others did in fact exist within himself, and concluded with even further sorrow that it, being his own disbelief and mistrust of himself and therefore others, must exist fully and completely. Though he knew that if he afforded himself such allowances, there would be recompense. He knew not of what kind the recompense, but it would be a most distasteful recompense of this, he was sure. He had often thought of Mrs. Brownstone, and considered her more up to leading Alastor than himself. She had never been known to give in to any moral dilemma. Maybe relinquishing his position to her would be a suitable recompense for his manipulation of this young chosen one. The previous keepers of the elements always knew of their personal callings and were given the choice to engage with these callings with the full knowledge of their responsibilities, even before discovering Alasia, whilst they stood on their own soil in their world, Earth. The keepers first learnt the skill and then the management of their prescribed talents. It was only after full and thorough mental, physical, and spiritual training that the keepers each embarked on their responsibilities, and never a moment before they were ready. All of the training occurred once the keepers had learned to both give and receive love in the land of Alasia, and all had learnt of its ways and understood its heartbeat. Only under the conditions noted above were the 4 keepers in every honest, earnest, and correct way, and without compromising their unwavering bias toward their own elements, prepared for their tasks ahead. And this was how it worked through all of Alasia's history, until now. A grace had been afforded Naeme because of his position, which allowed a little bending or embellishing of the rules in certain conditions. He had felt an urgency that doom was impending, and time was not of the essence. He could not place why he understood this. The elders had informed him that there was no movement in the Valley of Huxley or in the wastelands of Olactons. Some days he felt this more strongly than others, and today, more than ever, he had never felt more at home in his beliefs that there was a certain urgency at hand. Naeme was heavy with heart in these moments, and Mrs. Brownstone was right, and he knew his shame would be like a shame and a stench on him for some time to come if he ever lost it at all. If he searched himself a little further, he breathed a little breath out of his nostrils and decided that just now after delivering the girl, he would remove himself for a day and night of meditation and some very serious contemplation and soul-searching. Bridie and her flame were now in full rambunctious conversation with some townfolk for what felt like more time than she could count, and her head felt like it would implode. It was not so much that Bridie had been in conversation, rather. It was her that was being spoken at rather than being spoken to by several of the township's children. This was not so much annoying to Bridie. It just made it very difficult for her to follow all strings of conversation. All that she could do was look around at the crowd, hoping for tangible snippets of tangible information from what stories they were trying to tell. It had been explained to, or rather, frantically spoken to Bridie about, all the matters that concerned Alasia and all the evil plots that lay before it. Most of what she was told she could not remember, this being solely due to the large volume of information that she had been expected to ingest. Bridie did her best to remember as much detail as she could, but knew that this would be in vain. She could not be expected to remember Alasia's entire history and its founding animals. She couldn't even remember what kind of animals the founders were, and why it was even relevant to know anything about them. The townsfolk and her flame had been full of gusto and exuberance as they prattled about the series of adventures that had taken place over such a long period. She listened and nodded with enthusiasm where she thought that she was supposed to nod. She smiled and showed concern in the places that she thought she was supposed to do that too. After such a long time of listening, Bridie thought her head was going to burst from a headache, and she could tell that no one seemed to notice this. Her thoughts wandered wide, and they wandered far. She was more interested at this point in having her stomach filled with sandwiches. She sniffed the air almost out of reflex. She imagined that delectable coffee aroma, and was filled with more than minor disappointment that her desire to taste the coffee remained unfulfilled. A little sigh and a little drooping of the shoulders resulted from her disappointment. As so heartedly mentioned, Naeme, in his own childhood, had partaken in the ritual of historical learning through storytelling. What Naeme was unsure of, though, was whether his sly gains by way of children would work on someone not that much older than the children themselves. Of this he could not be sure, but would now allow his cunning to be tested. He knew that everybody fought better when they were personally connected by spirit. He could not believe others regarding the value of himself and the worth of his own leadership, and as a result, he couldn't believe in himself. If he could not believe in himself, how could he lead? And now here he was, about to embark on an act of coercion of a young girl into leading a fight into a war that she knew nothing of. It was never her fight, save for the gift that she was given. And this was how Naeme nursed himself into his sly coercion of the young'un. With these poor musings, Naeme decided that he would leave with immediacy and embark on his quest for peace and sanctity. And so Naeme walked quickly away, without even a glance toward Mrs. Brownstone and those filtering eyes. He could not bear them a second longer today. Brooke in contemplation and discovery. A glass of water which was held in hand, and stared into my green eyes, courtesy of Brooke, who was sitting on the step of her back porch in contemplation. She had not long finished work, and no one but herself was home. The relentless repetition and boredom of her job had led her to be in a dull state that afternoon. She was wondering and contemplating the pointlessness of her world. She lived in a pointless little town, working a pointless little job, not really knowing what pointless uni degree she wanted to study, or whether there is any point anyway. Her friends had no purpose in their worlds, even though they were a saving grace for her. And even though she had come to discover very many impossible things, such as commanding water, and travelling for who knows how long and how far underwater to improbable unknown places, this too came with no purpose. She continued to stare at the glass while making funny shapes with her lips and contorting her mouth into various shapes as she thought of it all. Brooke knew that her dad's career was not what he said it was, and for sure she did not know exactly what he did. There were many various clues over the years to attest to that, but she did not question it. Brooke could not quite figure out if her mother knew, but she suspected that she did, and just went on playing the dutiful wife. Occasionally, Brooke came to suspect her mother was probably in on it all, whatever it was. Brooke put down her glass, tucked her knees tightly into herself, and wrapped her arms around her shins, and rested her cheek on her knees. She closed her eyes and thought about letting a tear or two dribble out of her eyes, but did not. Brooke exhaled out of her nose instead, before resuming her normal breathing. She calmed herself again, before moving her cheek and positioning her chin on her knees instead. There was a contemplation of going to the beach and heading back to lands unexplored, or she could just swim in the pool in her backyard. The water did look lovely, but she sat, and she sat, and she sat some more until she felt almost dreamy as she watched the backyard trees swaying so softly in the breeze. The sun had shifted, creating more shade over the backyard, though it did nothing to quell the heat. She was just thankful the afternoon breeze was still active and cool on her skin. The afternoon breeze was too high in the treetops to cause any rippling or noise in the pool water. The familiar sound that water makes when someone emerges from it could be felt in Brooke's ear, and she looked down into the pool and was not alarmed to find an emerging presence from the water. This presence took the form of a tall and very striking woman. She emerged from under the water, but remained standing in the pool. Ethereal and otherworldly would be the words to describe her. She definitely did not come from here. Luminous would be the word that Brooke had decided would fit her description. The woman just stood and remained where she was. Brooke could not decide whether to remain or go down the steps and down into the pool area. The decision was taken out of Brooke's hands, and Brooke could not decide whether or not she was relieved. In the end, she decided that she was. Miss Ethereal, as Brooke had named her, walked out of the pool and through the open pool gate. Brooke imagined that the woman would have walked through it if it had not been open, and had even taken to wondering about these days later. Over the grass, the woman glided to the bottom of the steps where Brooke sat. The woman did not come up the stairs, but sat on the bottom step, then looked at Brooke for a moment before her soft voice spoke. Her hair and silk dress were drying rapidly under the warmth of the sun and under the gentle breeze which caught Olwen's hair ever so lightly. To Brooke, it would be that Olwen would be better suited to appearing in a hallway in an old mansion on some dark, blustery night. But here this woman, who seemed to Brooke to be a ghost, sat in full sunlight at the bottom of her stairs. I'm Olwen. Brooke, I reckon you already know that. Olwen smiled a little and gave a small nod of recognition before speaking again. You visit us in our land, so I come to visit you in yours. Brooke heard an accent in her voice, but for the life of her, she could not identify it. Part of her wished she had it herself. Not much is going on here, that's for sure. You're not missing much here. It is a very pretty place. Brooke nodded this time. She felt as though she was being coaxed even in these few brief moments, and she wasn't ready to bite yet. Your neck of the woods is a little more than pretty. It is surreal. Brooke looked down at her knees before she spoke again. She felt a little embarrassed. I don't even know what your place is called, or where it is. Smiling a little, she continued, It is not like it's sign-posted anywhere. Alasia is the name of all the land and everything that is in it. Before Olwen could continue, Brooke interrupted. She could hear a car entering the driveway up the side of the house. She stood and motioned Olwen to come with her and took her to the little pool house at the end of the yard. Some of the fam are home. I don't want to have to explain about you to them. No one comes back here much during the week. Brooke turned the little air conditioner on, for it was quite stifling inside. And I'm not going to lie, you look kind of out of place here. Anyway, keeping telling me about Alasia. This is what Olwen did. She shared and answered all manner of questions posed to her about Alasia by Brooke until Brooke herself was thoroughly satisfied, though she held back about asking questions regarding the strange events that had occurred to her the last time she had been to the beech forests of Alasia. She sensed that Olwen knew this too, though both skirted around the obvious. Instead, Brooke quizzed her about the talent she possessed with the water, the schooling regarding the role of the keepers of the elements. You're chosen because you are chosen. We don't always know why. My people and I have often surmised that it is not because of talent or even positive characteristics. Our best guess is that it is a purity or motivation of the heart, and we cannot even be sure of this. A question for the ages has always been this: are you born and created for it, or are you selected? Olwen studied Brooke's face for her level of comprehension before she spoke on further. None of the elements themselves are good or bad, Brooke. The elements just are. They do what they are created to do, which is to be as they are, and respond to that call as they will. Olwen waited for a moment, seeking reassurance from Brooke that she understood. Brooke did respond. There is a saying that I like, the wind will blow where the wind blows. Olwen's face beamed a little. Yes, she breathed and continued on. These elements need keepers to harness their natures for good, except for Earth, who does act like a goody-two-shoes, but even she can have her moments. Olwen seemed to amuse herself with this, but the irony or the joke or whatever it was about the Earth was lost on Brooke, so she asked instead, why would they need to be harnessed? Alasia seems to be a calm and perfect place. It is true, but there are dark forces at play. There is an evil place in Alasia, Brooke. A new heir has taken over the provinces of Alacdines, and he wants the lands of many worlds and the power of the elements, who are highly susceptible to whims of both good and evil, for they are mostly neutral in nature and carry more than a natural ability to give life or to destroy. Olwen paused. Brooke said nothing, wanting her to continue. In a war, many, many moons ago, and a great fight was on for control of the elements. This war was fought by both good and evil, who knew that if the power of the elements could be harnessed, then several worlds could be conquered. Whoever won that war would be granted rulership over the elements by the noble spirit. One condition of receiving the prize of rulership over the earth, wind, fire, and water was that keepers would be appointed over the spirits of these elements as protectors and guides to make sure that they stay the course, and they serve the master who had won them. That great war had caused a lot of bloodshed and sorrow. I am not sure the scars and stains of bloodshed will ever be truly healed. Brooke was a little stirred up inside. A great war? How did that come about? I did not think evil existed in that place. I have never had any sense of it since I was there. War, that is. I want to know about this war and how it came to be. how evil came to exist there. There is another great war coming. A new heir has been appointed in the deserts, and he wants complete rulership. His goal is not to control so much as is it enforcing an idealism. He wants his system in place, one that was formed by his ancestors who began to forge it out. This new heir wants to resurrect this idealism. It seems he is quite the family man after all. Olwen smiled a little. Brooke thought that she smiled at the strangest of things, and decided there was inside knowledge about these things to which she was not privy. You have a big role in this as a keeper, Brooke. You have a destiny to carve out, and to this point, you have been left alone to do so. But it is time for you to spend time in Alasia, for the darkness is rising a little quicker than expected. Brooke tilted her head and narrowed her eyes a little. I don't even know who I am to fight or what I am fighting for. Your primary role, Brooke, is to control the water, for it is neutral. Fighting for goodness is the purpose with which you do it, regardless of where it leads. This is truly only the lesson you need. This must be etched in your brain and in your heart. You must control the element only for good. Brooke understood this. It almost felt like instinct. It was a command she had decided within herself never to sway from, and hoped with all hope that she had the wherewithal to do so. Enter Alasia through your normal means in 2 nights' time. Someone will be waiting for you by the water's edge. It was dark now, and Olwen's porcelain form, to Brooke's mind, looked much more at home in the darkness of the little pool house. I will see you soon, Brooke. Olwen did not leave by the way she came, but she would leave in the little pool house by a portal created by the simple wave of her hand. Olwen nodded at Brooke, who at this point was transfixed by a glistening doorway of silvery blue which lit up the entire room. This visionary being stepped through it, and instantly the pool house was back to the dimness. Guthrie and Bridie become fast friends. Guthrie's physical recovery had been miraculous, and his body had been feeling almost superhuman. His energy levels were off the chart. He did not want this euphoric state to be ending any time soon, and it felt like that it was not going to either. He had not queried Wendy about it, though, for he feared that she would answer that it would wear off. Well, if that's the case, I'll have to rip myself a new one again, he said to himself. All he needed to do now was focus enough to master any fighting skill, any at all. The best part of the last few days had been spent using his excess energy on surfing the wind and perfecting his parkour skills. The better part of a few days had left Guthrie not really knowing or even caring about where he had left or where he was now. He was now flying through the air in who knows what part of Alasia. On his makeshift hoverboard, which he had fashioned out of some low-hanging clouds, he was staring at the ground beneath him as he rose to greater heights in the air. Unbeknownst to the lad, he was about to smash headfirst in a little hut, which was on the outer perimeter of a village. This village, which was not particularly small in diameter, had entirely escaped Guthrie's notice. His trajectory had not escalated enough for him to escape colliding with the tip of its thatch roof. Thud! There went Guthrie's torso first into the ridge-piece cover and let out a sorrowful oof as he collided with it without ceremony. His makeshift hoverboard evaporated into thin air, and he slid down the side of the roof helplessly, his face red from the impact. Thud! Guthrie smashed to the ground. He took in a few deep breaths whilst he was on his back on the green grass ground. Are you okay? Asked a young female voice. Guthrie took a second to lift his head a little and look to his right to see a young curly-haired girl standing quite tall and dressed in hunting clothes with a flame on a stick standing beside her. Behind her were a couple more folk, dressed in peculiar attire of which he could not distinguish. Guthrie presumed them to be townsfolk. If he were anywhere else but somewhere in Alasia, he would have thought he had a concussion, but much was the oddities of such a place as Alasia. Huh? He exhaled, putting his head back on the ground. What on earth were you doing on the roof? The girl queried, brushing the bush of red curls from her eyes. Guthrie exhaled and grinned. I wasn't on the roof. I banged myself into it. I did. It just came out of nowhere. How? I can't see a ladder or anything, plus the great noise that you made would suggest you banged into it. So, how did you? She almost whispered the last part, and her eyes grew wide with curiosity. Wheel, Guthrie was leaning up on his elbows now. I made a hovercraft out of a cloud, and I have been riding it round for a while now. I mustn't have been looking where I was going, and whop! I banged myself right into that roof there. Who are you? I'm Bridie, and next to me is Flame. Flame flickered a little higher and brighter in acknowledgement. Not a very original name, that. Guthrie stood to his feet. Me name's Guthrie. He nodded to the flame and then eyed Bridie. Are you a keeper, then? Would be me guess. Bridie nodded and cautiously asked, Are you keeper too? Hang on, let me guess. It isn't hard, really, especially if you were flying about in the sky. I would say you're the keeper of the air. Yep, that'd be me, Bridie. Yep, it would. Well, I am so happy to meet you. You are the first that I have met. Are you feeling better now? Her eyes became sunny. Of course you are. You are on your feet. Bridie motioned him as she turned on her heels, and in her most grown-up voice she said, Let's get you some afternoon tea, Guthrie. You must be very hungry if you've been flying about for days. It only took a moment for Bridie to return to her innocence, and almost whispered to contain her excitedness. You will not believe your eyes when you see what lies before you ... It is a feast for royalty. The feast in the big hall annex did not disappoint Guthrie, and he devoured food like someone who hadn't eaten for days. Of course, this was fitting, because he actually hadn't eaten for days. A desire for sweets and savoury pastries took his palate over, and his appetite was voracious. He ate for what seemed to be 3 people, and washed it all down with a jug of sweet, honeyed, pomegranate mead. There was great contentment to be had in leaning backward on the dining chair with a placement of arms behind head and a protruding gut on full display. A smile of pleasure sat firmly in place. You must have been hungry, Guthrie. I don't think I have ever seen anyone eat like that ever before. It really was quite amusing. Guthrie nodded without moving a muscle. I needed that. The pair sat for the afternoon, with Bridie sharing her story of how she came to be in Alasia, and how she had managed to skirt around her parents and everyone about her whereabouts for at least the next week, for which she felt both guilty and proud for doing so. Bridie eagerly quizzed Guthrie about many things, and he didn't mind in the least abating her curiosity. It was rarely anyone bothered to know much about him, and he kind of relished someone, even someone so young, taking such an interest. Guthrie eyed the girl, wondering how, what, and how much to share with her. Though there was nothing in her appearance that was remotely similar to his youngest sister, he felt an affinity toward her. His sister was most definitely more streetwise, but this girl was smart as a whip, and his sister, whilst curious about the people and surroundings around her, learnt through studious observation. The girl before him did no such thing. If she wanted to know something, she asked, and probed, until she got what she was after. I got a little sister. She ain't much like you, though. She isn't? No, she likes to sit and watch the world go by. Size things up. She does, and watches things from afar. But she is wise and smart as a cracker. With it. Bridie snorted a little, but with no derision, just curiosity, she said, You change your accent a lot, even mid-sentence. I am very curious about that. A little gruffly, Guthrie responded, Just depends on me mood sometimes, is all. Bridie sensed not to push the question, but take his accents into her own observance over the time they spent together to see what she could make of it all. He was curious about her, and she could help but to keep on probing him further. Where do you live? Still at home with your parents or in a flat somewhere? No, not with my parents. I haven't lived at home for a long time now. Oh, well, where do you live then, if not with them? Here and there and around the joint. Her eyes widened with a little excitement. A bit like a nomad or a gypsy. How exciting. To be so free like that. It was Guthrie's turn to offer a little smile at her excitement. She was still just an innocent child yet, another thing that separated her from his sister. His sister had not been childlike for quite some time, and he regretted that for her. A part of Guthrie left like he could somehow make up for it here with Bridie, and he was going to play along a little. Very much like that ... free to roam and do as I please. No one or nothing to hold me back. Just a shame I didn't have a boat, though, like a pirate of the high seas. Feigning disappointment, he told her that he just had a bike and then a broken-down old car when he got his license. Guthrie painted stories that were in a small part true, and regaled these tales with hearty embellishments that were almost too preposterous for words for the benefit of Bridie. One party relished the role of storyteller, and the other relished in the receivership of the spoken of preposterousness, and took in every word with the veracity of a sponge soaking up liquid. Her eyes never left this face as Guthrie made her recoil, and gasp in horror and giggle too. The lad's life was not one of ease, and it never had been. His mother was from the good, part of the city, whilst his father was not. Not long after mutual attraction had caused an unlikely pairing, his mother was soon to be considered as not being from the good side of the city anymore. This did not bother Guthrie's mother, as she remained for quite a time, several years in fact, in the weighty throngs of a blinded romance. She herself was an idealist after all. Passion had taken a while to give way to the harsh life now endured by being married to a dreamer who relied on nothing more than a silvery tongue and a slippery way. After exhausting the resources of his local compatriots and somehow averting the responsibilities of any monetary payback, Guthrie's father usually atoned for his slights, whatever they were, by some backdoor dealings of certain nefarious kinds. All of his father's business dealings had never been made known to Guthrie, so he could only speculate as to what they were, resulting in Guthrie's dad coming a cropper for his last time. In Guthrie's early years, and under his 10th decade, Guthrie's father, Bill, succumbed to the hand of a merchant who was from a good part of town quite far away. These merchants from London were not quite as forgiving of Bill's creative swindlings as they were from Guthrie's dad's own town, and this led to his untimely demise and never reaching his 26th year. Guthrie's mother Edith took to working a supermarket position not too soon after the loss of her beloved, and had eased her own mourning by taking comfort in a local neighbourhood mechanic. Edith had managed to find a suitor quite different to her dreamer husband, and she knew her new fit well as both a hard worker and a fast drinker. For Edith to find her solace, she bore more children in quick succession, and her 4 children would soon come to know well the workings of both the good and bad sides of town. It was only after the death of his maternal grandfather, and the fact that his own mother and stepfather had split up, that he, himself, and his younger siblings for the first time, and his mother for the second time, were considered being part of the family on the good side of town once more. It was even rumoured that Edith might find herself back in the family's will. Fitting into Edith's family was difficult, and Guthrie and his siblings would live in constant reminder of where they truly belonged, which was not on the good side of town. Edith had no such problem herself, except for the odd chiding by friends of the family, and Edith herself would give her children no ease regarding their status. She simply accepted this familial acceptance for herself and ignore any mention of her offspring's bastardhood. It would not be uncommon for Edith to visit her good family without any of her children in tow, and this suited Guthrie just fine. He was happy and content on his side of town, and there he would keep his solace either on friends' couches or in someone's spare room. His siblings were to be found constantly with their own father, but Guthrie himself was not welcome. His mother had weekly offered on more than one occasion to come and stay at the family estate, but Guthrie declined many more times than he accepted, only ever going on his mother's insistence for the odd special occasion, and usually for her own benefit. "Guthrie, have you got another story? Your life is so exciting." Guthrie had realised that his thoughts had wandered off. "Yeah, I do. Last one, though," he warned her. "There was this time once where I was feeling a bit bored and didn't know what to do with meself, so I took myself off on me bike into the woodlands near the creek, near me old house from when I was a kid. Anyway, when I got down by that there creek, I couldn't believe my eyes. You see, the creek wasn't a creek but a river, which went all the way into the sea, and we lived near the sea at this ear time." He paused and then said, I couldn't believe my eyes. "Bridie!" Someone was calling for her. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked at Guthrie disappointed. This story was going to be a good one, I just know it. Then she exhaled, remembering her cup of coffee for days gone by, and sighed. "I never get to finish anything around here. Promise, Guthrie, you'll finish the story for me soon?" He grinned at her eager face. "Of course I will. Anyway, who's calling ya?" "Oh, that sounds like Naeme. He's the wise one around here, kind of like the town mayor." "Bridie!" "Coming!" she called, taking Guthrie's hand and motioning him to get up, which he had, and she guided him into the village square. Acamar, the lonely little star. Along the road, Gigi continued to amble, having now fully recovered from her previous encounter. She was in good spirits again and feeling like her old self. Allura had offered, and so had the earth, to heal her of all ailments, but she had always resisted. Gigi loved her war wounds. Of course, there were certain days in which the pain was so great that she had almost called upon the elements to ease her of her ailments, but the old woman resisted. A stream could be heard very gently and not too far away, and the sound of that sweet water was a little too much for Gigi to resist, and so she made her way toward the sound. The earth had kindly forged a little pathway for her, guiding her to a little stump by the stream, which allowed Gigi to both sit down and not bend too far over to take water into her palms, and gulp. She did so without caring or being self-conscious about her slurps, and she relished the moment. At the end of her little delight, Gigi wiped her mouth with her wrist, and as she did, so she noticed a little silver glow in the water. Could it be? She leaned in a little closer to look under the water, and a little pointed star sat just under the clear and small ripples of the surface of the stream. Some shiny stones sat on the stream bed underneath it. "Oh, my little star, Acamar!" Gigi was delighted. "How I thought that I lost you, little star!" The little star reverberated a little more brightly in response. "What are you doing, little star Acamar, underneath the water? That is not the natural place for you, you know." Acamar reverberated brightly. There was a quiet, soft voice that echoed through the still air and seemed to come from nowhere but everywhere at the same time. "I am lost and stuck, Gigi. I can't get out. You know who put me here." "Yes, I do know who, but how do we get you out, little star?" "Only by the light of the moon, but the moon won't shine here any more, Gigi," Acamar shrieked softly, emitting a little despair. "What do you mean? The moon doesn't shine here any more. That is preposterous. I only saw it last evening." Gigi chided, and then felt a little guilty. "It is getting to evening now, Gigi, and you will see for yourself in this little spot where I am stuck. The moon won't shine any more, and I can't ride the moonbeam home. I am very homesick." "This is a dreadful spot that you are in, my little Acamar. I wonder what we can do about the mess. How are you surviving in there with all of that water and no moonbeam rays? It is a wonder that you are alive at all." "The curse didn't say anything about my other stars shining down, so it is their starlight that feeds me by night." "What a strange little curse that this is." With curiosity, Gigi continued in almost a whisper to not alarm the timid little Acamar, and she leaned in closer to the star in the stream. "Are you sure it is, you know who? It doesn't seem like it's kind of a curse at all, and a very important question with it is, why were you cursed at all?" Acamar shriveled back a little and lost a little of her shine. I don't want to say really, Gigi, my friend. It was such a time ago, and really not worth remembering at all." "Well, okay then, friend. I won't push the subject, but we must get you out of that water." Gigi shook her head a little. "It is beyond me how you are still alive at all, but I am very, very happy about it. I thought I lost you long ago." Naeme, that retreat of sweet solace into the cabastrial realm, that place of sweet rest and restoration, had eased the soul of Naeme somewhat, though not with that full sweet completeness which comes from rejuvenation in such a place as cabastrial. Cabastrial was the celestial place of solace that it was, a place of serenity whose atmosphere bathed any soul in a proverbial chicken soup or a real one, if a creature or soul decided. Its atmosphere produced a quiet balm of one's own choosing, which cleared the mind and soothed the body. Each person or being that frequented the place named Cabastrial would experience Cabastrial in their own personal way. To some, it would be a place of cocooning and being wrapped in a warm blanket. Others would enter the place and experience it as their own desired reality. It was a way to expel nervous energies, displacements, and various pains to bring one back to equilibrium. Whatever was needed for healing and restoration of body, mind, and spirit, Cabastrial would be. It could be an anchorage to steady, or a harbourage of refuge. For Naeme, Cabastrial was a mountain from which he sat on top and meditated for several days and nights without water or food, and Cabastrial's balm was a balm that felt like the warm cotton blanket his mother had wrapped him in childhood, for it was his mother and that blanket that gave him his first taste of comfort and peace. Cabastrial's balm, which felt so much like that blanket, held the faint smell of chocolate and cinnamon, his first hot drink in memory. For the first time in Naeme's experience, this place named Cabastrial had not given him the complete absolution for which he longed, and this added further to his turmoil. There was a minor loss of hope within his soul, and with it a small scarring. Naeme saw in his own mind's eye his error to be a small blemish which tainted his own soul, like one tiny speck of dirt on an otherwise pristine white wall. Once this speck was seen on this pristine wall, it could not be unseen, and regardless of how perfect the white wall was, there it was, that tiny black mark on which he fixated both day and night. As Naeme saw this wall to be as his very own soul, he wondered if there was any chance of its repair and that tiny black speck to be removed from this wall. For if he could fix and remove this speck from the wall, he would therefore fix his very own soul. Regarding this matter, Naeme realized that all one had to do in his own personal analogy was take a cloth and wipe that dirty little spot off of that pristine white wall, and it would be gone for good, and if sense were to be had, it would never be thought of again. Unfortunately, even in his own analogy, he could not even find a damp cloth anywhere around himself to wipe off that damned speck on that pristine white wall, and Naeme, so bereft at not locating this proverbial cloth, could not see the forest for the trees, even in his own mind's eye. Therefore, he did not, or maybe could not, find the sense in his own thought to spit on his own shirt and wipe the mark off with his very own sleeve. If he had thought of doing such a thing as wiping that blemish with his own spit, his conscience might have been somewhat appeased, hoping his grievous actions, in reality, may have a redemptive outcome, therefore giving him ease in his position as sage and seer of Alasia. The inevitable feeling for Naeme was that he would not feel tarnished as a leader. Thus, his own inner sanctions would not allow him to find this solution in his own analogy, and so it seemed that his own inner self had purposed and caused Naeme to find sanctions, and therefore absolution, in reality. As tiny as that minor ache was, it seemed to throb more heartedly than all of the peace and virtue which was the normal countenance of Naeme. He wondered, despite his internal and external countenances of peace and virtue, if he could ever redeem himself of his manipulations of the young Bridie and remove the blemish which plagued him so. Naeme shook off his own wonderings and shifted his mind to the tasks at hand. He still had his sense of duty, and with it his full measure of equilibrium, and it had been noted to him as he pondered all these thoughts in his chair in the village that finally Guthrie had made his way into the village of Naeme. Naeme had also been informed that young Bridie had acquainted herself with him. It was not a custom of Naeme's to call out or yell. He had considered it uncouth and undignified, and a completely improper thing to do, but reckless abandon had been his portion in these moments, and he decided to call out, and it felt quite cathartic. To his own surprise, he broke his own thoughts and heard himself call, "Bridie!" Called Naeme, and it was not lost on him the looks of surprise and bewilderment of the forest creatures around him, and he secretly basked in their surprise. Naeme needed to only call once, "Coming, Naeme!" and Bridie came bounding around holding the hand of Guthrie, who hobbled a little behind her as she dragged him and looked a little worse for wear with it. "And who is this that you have with you, young Bridie?" Naeme looked the bedraggled boy over and pretended not to know. Excitedly, Bridie exclaimed, "This is Guthrie, the keeper of the wind." "Is that so?" "Yes, he rode on the wind and bumped straight into the invisible wall and knocked himself clean out." "Not too bright then, eh?" There was a twinkle in Naeme's eye as he continued to look at the young man. Guthrie didn't protest because he did indeed feel a little dumb. "Well, at any rate, you have impeccable timing. You have arrived right on schedule, lad. Good work. Wendy isn't with you, I see, though I suspect she had a lot to do with your arriving right on time." Again, Guthrie said little, as he was regularly attuned to observing and weighing up new environments before engaging or taking part in them. His usually guarded facade was not so guarded. Something in his instincts could not fully lift his guard, though his guard was there, but mostly he felt relaxed, and it was an almost instinctive feeling. Is this what little kittens felt like in safe hands? He liked the feeling. There was a softness, a placidity to this place that he had not experienced before in his own world. Not only did he like it, but he was trusting this place with it, and this was another condition which was unfamiliar to him. Unlike any other time in his life, Guthrie gave himself up to the feeling of security that this village of Naeme offered, and he had no qualms about doing so. In fact, Guthrie relaxed. His jaw and his muscles almost felt pliable, and for the first time in a very long time he felt peace and joy. And he also felt what he could only assume was a condition frequently referred to as feeling relaxed. "You okay there, Guthrie? You look like you were off with the fairies." Guthrie snapped out of his thoughts and looked at Bridie, who was watching him curiously. He just nodded down at her. "Well, let's get you fed then. That is the first thing that he likes to do before anything when someone arrives." Again, Bridie took Guthrie's hand and led him to the food hall. Both John and the comrade sit and wait. John and his comrade still remained in the brush and had witnessed a new young handler. A big, dumb, useless thing by the look of him, all brawn, no brain cells to speak of, just a mass of cells with no usefulness attached to them. It so happened that both John and his comrade were thinking much the same thing as they both spouted the same sentiments. John hated that. He did not want any part of his own personality associated with such a devilish form. John considered himself a good man who only wanted good things, and who only mostly had good thoughts. He wasn't perfect, he knew that, but he was good. The comrade who sat next to him knew better, though. He had been around this merry-go-round many times before, and he knew that John considered himself to be good, and he always started out that way. But things eventually turned, and he eventually surrendered himself, and the comrade always had Gigi to thank for it. This life cycle was playing itself out like all others. John and Gigi were the only players that ever remained the same. Their lives kept cycling while all others moved on, and the comrade was tasked with hosting them every single time. The only other player to receive any benefit at all was that of Typhon, who both relished and despised seeing Gigi relive her life repeatedly. Hours now had passed, and the feasting in the hall was completed. Guthrie's initiation by way of feast and town hall introductions in the town centre had been completed. It was time for the township to turn in for the evening, which was by custom and not by command in this quaint little place. Whenever a newcomer arrived, the same welcome was always given, and much merriment was had that it tuckered all of the townsfolk out, and they, all by joyous exhaustion, turned themselves in for the night, to sleep without sound or stirring. This was when John would strike and enter the township through woodlands and take the back entrances through to the town centre. These rear parts of the township were mainly the back walls of buildings and shops and had no rear entrances. The paths through these buildings were mainly unlit due to them never being used in the evening. These buildings were built and scattered and in no particular order, which allowed them to cast shadows and therefore easy to hide against, should anyone stir. Of course, no one ever really stirred, for there was never anything nefarious or sinister that ever occurred here. It was quite easy to wander about at night. What was kept locked and secretive were the portals that entered other realms. They were always under heavy guard and virtually impenetrable. These portals usually resided inside homes or sacred vestibules and were not in the pathway of John. Once he made his way through these back entrances, he would come upon paths that were only dimly lit, and these did not bother his journey too much either, for no one stirred in their little huts and houses either. These dimly lit lamps were only for the guards of the portals to have enough light to light their way to report on their duties. John knew that the changing of the guard only happened at 7 p.m. and then at 5 a.m., both times of which the township was in darkness. The further John had to travel into the heart of the town, the more streetlights grew brighter. More townsfolk frequented these areas in the evening time and even in the early hours, particularly if people were setting off on one-night time journeys. These journeys were for townsfolk to go nocturnal creature watching, or for the younger ones to go into the woodlands to share scary stories over campfires. John did not think that tonight was one of those nights, as all would be tucked up tightly, but his comrade had given him the invisibility cloak just in case. His only obstacle now would be opening the door to the little hut undetected. He had remembered from previous times from entering the hut that the door was getting creaky. Unsure how to bypass the issue, he should have sought advice from his comrade beforehand. Nevertheless, he reassured himself, saying, "I'll figure it out as I go," he reassured himself.